We're going to have then two people talking today. Firstly, Natalia Carfi, currently based in Argentina, and she's also from Open Data Charter. She's going to talk about how we can enable the collaboration between governments and organizations to open up data and respond effectively to policy challenges. And after, we are going to have Stefaan Verhulst from GovLab talking about how this project GovLab is strengthening the organizations that is involved with. Now we have Paulo. Hello, Paulo. Welcome.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Good.
Perfect.
Okay.
So now I was going to give you the word for you to moderate the next panel and introduce all our guests. If you're all set, I'll give you the word and
you can start. Okay, thank you, Anna, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I hope you guys are enjoying the event and learning a lot more about the Data for Good movement. So today we're going to talk a bit about the open data movement with two speakers with a lot of experience in this area, Natalia Carfi and Stefaan Verhulst. So we'll start with Natalia Carfi, the Deputy Director of Open Data Charter. So Open Data Charter is a collaboration between over 100 governments and organizations working to open up data based on a shared set of principles, working mostly in the areas of anti-corruption, climate action, and pay equity. Natalia also worked as the Open Government Director for the Undersecretary of Public Innovation and Open Government of Argentina. She was also Open Government Coordinator for the Digital Division of the Government of Chile and for the City of Buenos Aires. Thank you for joining us. Natalia will start by presenting a bit what is the Open Data Charter movement, and then we'll skip to some questions at the end. You can answer questions. You can ask questions in the audience, and we'll also go through those.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today in this panel with a friend and colleague, Stefaan. And I'll do a short introduction on what the Open Data Charter is before we go into the conversation. Let me see if I can do this right. Is my screen showing okay?
Not yet.
Not yet.
But it's loading, isn't it? Are we there?
We can hear you, but the screen is
not the presentation.
But Anna has a presentation, so maybe we can use that.
Yes, so give me.
Yeah, so you'll try to do it then. Sorry for that.
All right. Just give me some seconds. I'll be able to share it just now. Meanwhile, we also have Stefaan that is going to join in a few minutes, which is great. Okay, presentation here.
Thank you, Anna.
And I'm sharing screen. One second. Okay, I have the presentation and I should be able to share it just.
If not, I can speak of the Open Data Charter without the presentation, no problem. Just let me know.
Okay, it's here.
Great.
Yeah,
so I guess everybody can see the presentation now. The Open Data Charter was born 5 years ago now. We turned 5 in September. So it's been September. We celebrated the whole month. And if you, Anna, you can go into the next slide, please. So the Open Data Charter was born around the discussion of 6 core principles that any government on any level should work with if they are going to set up an open data policy, an open data initiative. We held international conversations, online questionnaires in 3 languages, webinars, and workshops in person when we could meet. And then out of this global conversation came out these 6 core principles that you are seeing right now. We had a revision of the principles 2 years ago, and once again, the global consultation ended up on the 6 principles still being useful, still being explanatory, still being guiding principles for any open data policy. As you can see, they're very far front, but you will be able to find more information on what each of these principles entail. But out of this set of principles came the organization, the Open Data Charter. We are a team that helps actually governments and civil society organizations from around the world work within these 6 principles. We now work with over 75 governments from all over the world. You can see there in the map are all those ones in blue are adopters of the charter, but we also have endorsers from civil society and universities and some private companies also. So we work, as you see, globally and keep on getting requests for endorsers and adoptions pretty much on a monthly basis. Next slide, please. We work within this data impact framework where we understand that just the publication is not the core work. We need to be able to add value to the data that is being open. So we understand that the data impact is actually created, the data value, the added value of the data being open is created when it's being reused, and then making participation part of the core business of any open data policy. Next slide, please. And so what I wanted to share was a few of the key learnings that we've had after these 5 years of work. The first one can be summed up with the sentence published with a purpose. So it's been almost 10 years or a little bit more of open data initiatives from all around the world. Most of those actually initiated with an open data portal where governments just published any data that they could without understanding the needs or the questions or the requests from civil society, from the external actors. Well, that shift a little bit over, I guess, 2 years ago. The open data community has started to be really keen on this publish with a purpose idea that we started spreading out. First, understand the problem, the civic problem that you're trying to tackle, and then work on publishing the data. So we can create and co-create public value out of the opening up of the data. It's not easy to open up data. It's not even free. You have to have human resources working on that, and so this bit of collaboration and participation with the data reusers, understanding what the purpose of the open data initiative is, it's critical. So prioritization, doing workshops, doing consultations. There's a zillion ways to do this, but the key idea is we're not longer working under the publish and they will come idea. It's published with a purpose. Understand the purpose of the open data policy. And so thank you. And so what we've done to help out with this idea from the Open Data Charter was creating these practical tools that are known as the Open Up Guides. Those are, as I said, practical tools that just give a set of data sets that should be published in order to work on any of these 3 topics. So we collaborated with civil society organizations that are very, very good and very much involved in the thematic areas where these Open Up Guides work within. So we partner, for example, with World Resources Institute to create the Open Up Guide on climate action. We brought in the open data knowledge, they brought in the climate change one, and we created this tool where you have a set of possible data sets to open in order to move forward with an open data policy for climate action. The same thing happened with anti-corruption, and the same thing happened with agriculture. And we're not moving forward, we're creating another set of practical tools of Open Up Guides on different topics, always collaborating with those that were within the thematic area. And we bring in our knowledge and they bring their knowledge. And so we do the same as we ask governments to do, we collaborate. Next slide, please. The other key learning of this past 5 years is the open data community has now understand the importance of the alignment with privacy. We've been doing a better job in the last years of connection with the privacy organizations and the privacy governmental institutions in order to collaborate and understand the balances that need to occur in order to be able to publish as much as you can, understanding what the limitations of privacy are. So access to information, it's a right, but privacy is also a right. And we need to understand that and be able to better have straightforward conversations around the costs and benefits that lead to the recognition of these collective rights and personal rights also. Next slide. And then the third key learning out of these 5 years is, and this I can say also because I used to be a public official, as Paulo said, opening up data entails a cultural change. It's not just the technical bit that needs to be dealt with. One of the most important things to do if you're working on an open data initiative is to understand that the training component, the learning component, it's key. Of course, you have to deal with data mining and the portal and everything, but you also need to be able to spread the word and give training both to public officials that will be working or are working on open data and civil society organizations, so they can reuse civil society organizations and journalists and universities and whoever wants to, but that in order to be able to reuse the data, you need to understand what open data means, what are the schemes and the standards that are being used. So the learning component is super important. And then just for the bit of government, the culture within government of opening up anything that they create is not there yet everywhere. So we need to understand that this is a cultural change where public officials need to shift the way that they think, where they think because they create the data, they are the owners of the data. We need to shift that into the citizens being the owners of the data any public official creates. Understanding the limits of privacy, as I said before, no, but that's a shift in mentality. And those kinds of changes take time. And I guess that's it for me now. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the great introduction. So now I'll let Stefaan take the stage for a few minutes. So Stefaan Verhulst is the co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer of the Governance Laboratory at NY University, also known as GovLab, where he's responsible for building a research foundation on how to transform governance using advances in both science and technology. So more specifically, GovLab aims to answer questions such as how do we open up government data for solving problems? How do we create public value by exchanging data across several sectors? And what are the global impacts of open data? So let's hear Stefaan talk a bit about these topics for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go to our debate. Thank you.
Great, and thanks for having me. And it's always great to be on a panel with Nati. Great to see you as well. And it's always hard to follow Nati. I mean, what else is there remain to be said, right? So yes, Paulo, as you mentioned, I'm the co-founder here of GovLab, and so we are looking into how do we transform the way we make decisions, i.e. make them more legitimate, make them more effective. And specifically, we've looked into two assets. On the one hand, people, so we do a lot of work around citizen engagement, collective intelligence, but the other part, surprise, surprise, is data. And here over the last few years, we've really tried to understand how do we open up data as an asset within society that can improve the way we make decisions, the way we provide services, but ultimately also improve people's lives as a result of that. And especially the last few years, we've also not only looked into how do you open up government data, which of course, as Nati said, is still, there's still a lot to be done there, but also how do we engage with one of the other big data holders, which includes the private sector. And so we've done a lot of work around how do we also unlock private sector data in order to inform public interest decisions. And so one of the big lessons learned from both the open government data space and from the private sector space is that to a large extent, this is about relationships, and this is really about developing new kinds of partnerships, meaning the areas that we have seen that have the highest impact quite often in the use of open government data and open private sector data, of course, is where there is some kind of a partnership between the supplier and the user of the data, realizing, of course, that you do, anyway, also want to make, anyway, an environment where data, especially certain kinds of data, is also freely available. Now, we call this the need to think about data collaboratives. And so I've shared a few links with the organizers that perhaps can also be added to the chat to illustrate some of the projects that we have. Now, the big challenge with data collaboratives, i.e. setting up new kinds of public-private partnerships in order to access and provide access to data. And first of all, is that there is no one way of doing this. There is a whole range of ways to actually establish data collaboratives, and I have no time to really go into detail to give you the flavor of the types of partnerships that you can have. But I think one big lesson learned from now, anyway, I guess 4 years of actually looking into setting up data collaboratives across the world is that we need to really find ways to make this A, more systematic, B, more sustainable, and C, more responsible. And this is also applicable to the open data space, is that how do we make this more systematic so that it's not like an ad hoc, one-off kind of nice thing to do, but that it actually is part of the way you go about making decisions and go about leveraging data. How do you make this sustainable? Because a lot of the, like for instance, we have also studied, studied like, 37 case studies, detailed case studies on the use of open data. Turns out that many of those initial open data initiatives, quite often they have a lot of energy, and then it stops because there is no real thinking about how do you make this sustainable over time. And so we really have to make progress with regard to the sustainability of those initiatives. And then lastly, as Nati already said, clearly there are a set of risks involved that we need to understand, and how do we make this more responsible. So what we have been trying to focus on is how do we make data collaboratives and open data more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And so I'm gonna share 4, I could make a whole laundry list, but I'm gonna only leverage and point to 4 what we believe are areas that we need to make progress in order to actually become more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. The first one is, as Nati already said, actually strengthening the demand side for data. Too often we have seen that many data initiatives start with the data and then say, oh, what can we do now that we have access to data set X? And so the result quite often is indeed interesting insights, but frankly, I've also been kind of frustrated that some of those results are frankly, somewhat marginal sometimes, and especially hard to sustain. And the reason why that is because we sometimes don't spend enough time on thinking what is the question that matters, that we seek to or should seek to answer. And so in the last few years, I've also gone public and said, it's great to have 100 data sets. What I also would like to have are 100 questions that matter, so that we as a society, we can organize ourselves to actually answering those questions, and then looking into how do we open up data to answer that question, or how do we establish partnerships that can actually provide answers to questions that matter. And so the 100 Questions Initiative is an effort to really change that mindset and become more of a question-led mindset. And frankly, I call this is our effort to develop a new science of questioning. I think we have made great efforts in data science. We also need to make efforts in question science, because it turns out that actually we don't really, as a society, we are not really good in formulating questions. We are not good in formulating problems. We're also not good in formulating questions. And so what we try to do here is to actually make progress towards that end. And again, I can spend your whole conference here on talking about the lessons learned and how to, and how, anyway, we can take this up in a variety of ways, because anyway, we focus on some global problems such as migration, gender, and so on. But I believe that every city or every community should actually engage in an exercise about what are the 100 questions that matter to them, to then align their open data, align their data strategy, align. That's one example to make this more systematic. Another example that we've worked on is, and Nati referred this as well somewhat when she was talking about culture change, is that we actually need a new profession that really can think about data and how do we steward data to inform public decision making. And so we have been calling for that new kind of profession, which we call chief data stewards, that are really, and it doesn't have to be a position, it could be a function or it could be a role, but it has to be somewhat more professional than ad hoc. And it has to be a well-designated kind of role that frankly deals with internal coordination, because it turns out releasing data is not only a result of the demand, it's quite often a result of a lot of internal coordination in order to get the sign-off. And if you have no one owning that process, it's so easy to get derailed, and it's so easy to basically give up and declare that it's too hard to do. And so we need to have a designated profession, and this is within the public sector, but it's equally and even more important in the private sector, because frankly, the private sector is not organized at the moment to respond to solicitations around their data. We get quite often asked, who should we talk to in corporation X around the data? And unfortunately, most of the time I have to say, good luck finding out, because there is no real line of authority quite often, or a designation to solicit, to respond to solicitation. And it's quite often not the chief data officer, it's not the chief privacy officer, so who is it then? And so that's where we need that chief data stewardship thing. And then a last element that I will raise, again, because I see we are running out of time and I don't want to dominate this here, is that in addition to strengthening the demand and strengthening the supply of the data ecosystem, we also actually have to engage the public much more in really having a conversation about reuse of data. Meaning open data is reusing data that was collected, and most of the data governance frameworks and the data discussions are always and most of the time about collecting data, not about what do we do once the data has been collected and reuse that for other purposes. And so what we believe, and that's another site that I've shared, what we believe is that we need to actually develop a new public debate about the reuse of, and then subsequently policies, but a new public debate about what are the expectations of people around the reuse, which is quite often of their data, to inform public decisions. And so one initiative that we started over the summer was a new kind of citizens assembly around the reuse of data, which we, surprise, surprise, called the Data Assembly. And we focused initially here locally in New York City, where we are based, where we actually engaged in a structured manner a public in order to have a deliberation about the reuse of the data, which included the reuse of government data. And so it turns out that people have a very sophisticated perspectives. It's not either or, right? It depends. And so we need to understand what are the conditions, what are the red lines that they feel should not be crossed, but also what do they feel comfortable in actually asking more reuse because they can see the value of certain kinds of data sets. And I think, again, that we need to scale and we need to become more sophisticated and actually engaging the public around the reuse of their data. And this is just an initiative that we hope can be replicated by others, including perhaps in Portugal, in order to have a more public deliberation about that. So with that, Paulo, I saw you got nervous. I got took too much time of the schedule here, but these are just a few examples on how we, again, can become more systematic, sustainable, and responsible in how we reusing data through open data and data collaboratives.
Okay, thank you so much for the great introduction. So I have a lot of questions on my own, but I'll try to focus a bit on the ones I think are most interesting. So I would like to start you both by asking, how do the governmental entities measure the impacts of having open versus closed data? So for instance, in Portugal, we have some cities like Cascais, Águeda, Lisbon, or Porto, which have open data platforms. Some of them I don't think people really use or are not really updated. It was probably an ad hoc project. So what motivated the governments that you work with into sharing data, and how did they measure the impact of doing so?
So impact in open data, it's a huge question, which we can talk for a zillion hours. But I'm just going to go in what motivated governments to start open data. And this is just a few examples of the governments that I've worked with, being a governmental official, and that I've worked with now from the Open Data Charter. So at the beginning of this, I guess it was kind of something everybody was doing. If you wanted to be part of the open data, of the Open Government Partnership, for example, or working within the Open Government Frame, it was mostly understood that you needed to have an open data portal. So it was part of a bigger conversation of trying to develop an open government strategy where open data was seen as a key component, and that's why we had this idea of publish and they will come. You know, you had to have the open data portal, and not understanding what the data needs were, what the data demands were. It was just understanding, just having that portal. And then I think two major things helped out develop more open data policies. The understanding that governments have a lot of reporting responsibilities, where they create a lot of data to report to the UN, to report to ACD, to report to whatever international mechanism they have agreements with. And so there was locked public value there because they just created that data for reporting purposes. And working with civil society organizations and universities, understanding that data could actually create more value than the one that was already created, started to spread. And so we see open data initiatives, specifically thematic ones, like the ones on climate change or the ones on anti-corruption, that are moving forward because of that, because of the conversations between civil society and governments. And then the other one is that data became a hot topic for citizens also, mostly because of scandals. but kind of the Cambridge Analytica one and things like that. But it brought the light into data, and so governments are starting to realize that they needed to take a public stand on what they were going to do, what they were doing, and what they were going to do with the data they were creating. So I guess those were like two push movements that I've seen on open data policies.
Yeah, thanks, Paulo, for that question. And you probably have, anyway, or you might have read some of my work on that demand for more evidence about the impact, because anyway, as I've said, I've made public in several occasions that we actually need more data about the use of data. It's surprising how little data-driven the data space is, and we do need to make more progress. It doesn't mean it's easy, right? And I've written 2 books about the impact of open data, open access, by the way, to reflect on that. And I think there are, anyway, just for the sake of time, 2 reflections. One is that data is a 2-step process to make impact. And you never have from data to impact, you have from data to insight. And then how that insight is being used generates societal impact. And too often, we only focus on the first part, right? How do we get from data to insight? But we ignore that actually you do need to have an environment in place that then can act upon the insight and translate that into societal value. And so we not only need to have data intelligence, we also need to have decision intelligence so that the data can actually improve the way we go about making decisions. So that's one. And then 2 is that we do need to understand the taxonomy of impact. And so we have typically suggested that we need to try to have a full-pronged taxonomy with regard to impact of open data. One is about, which is the typical or the usual way of thinking about open data, is that data can be used to improve governance and the way we actually make decisions, right, in the public interest. And that's both at the policy level and at the public service level. And then, surprise, surprise, it turns out that actually of public officials are the biggest users of open data to achieve those ends. Second area is to empower individuals, right? So that you can actually provide access or insights that then individuals can use in their daily lives. And what we've seen in COVID-19, the majority of the use of open data was public communication, right? It was about using data to inform citizens so that citizens can be better prepared to deal with the pandemic. And that generates its impact from my point of view, and it can actually save people's lives if you think about the use of public communication towards that. Then the third category is about creating economic value. And anyway, if you go to our websites, we've actually done like an analysis of all the studies about economic, and we need much more. But clearly there is economic value. We were one of the first organizations to actually, through our Open Data 500, to document the corporations that would not exist without actually access to open data. And so you see that it actually is also an economic engine. And then the last, which is what Nati referred to, the last bucket of impact is really about solving public problems. How can you use open data to address climate change? How can you use open data to address, for instance, here in the US, racial inequality, to actually make clear that indeed there is racial segregation in certain cities that you otherwise would not be able to document if you would not have open data, for instance, right? And so, so that's one way, is to think of it as a 2-step process, but then also try to classify the types of impact that you can have to show the breadth of opportunity, but also to then develop indicators that allows us to become more data-driven in this whole space.
Okay, thank you so much for the great points. So for the next question, I'll mix one question from the audience with one question that I had. So someone in the audience is asking, how do you pursue private or corporate organizations to participate in open data collaborations? And I'll mix it with the question I have. that so it is clear that private data from companies such as telecommunication companies is very important for specific use cases like natural disasters or COVID-19 pandemic. So how do you measure the trade-off between the possible privacy issues, even with some pseudonymization implemented, and the benefit that people gain from this data being publicly released? You can talk about some specific projects if you want. The question is a bit broad, I know.
I'll leave it for you, Stefaan, about the data collaboratives with private sector. We from the Open Data Charter do not have any current projects with corporate or private organizations.
Great. Well, I will be. It's a big question. I will try to be short here. One, I think. Is to indeed have a very strong data responsibility approach with regard to your question, Paulo, of how do you anticipate the risk. But again, we also have to, as a society, be aware that there is a potential risk of not using using data, but there is also a risk for society if we don't find a way to use the data, right? And so it is not a simplistic kind of one way is anyway is better than the other way. We really need to work through across the data lifecycle. What are the potential risks that might exist, starting from the collection, because the risks of data collaborative is not just at the sharing. Anyway, how was the data collected? What's the provenance of the data? What's the quality of the data? What's the bias of the data? And how this ultimately will end up. And so having a across the life cycle of data collection, storage, and so on, having a data responsibility view is what we advocate for. And anyway, we will release probably next month a journey, a data responsibility journey that will actually probe the different actors to really be aware of those kinds of risks as well. Now, as it relates to the private sector, why would, anyway, in the past when we did this, I was saying, you're so naive, why would private sector, and first of all, I might agree with that, but how do the private sector, why would they even give up their crown jewels? And obviously, it is a bit of a heavy lift quite often from a risk point of view, privacy risk, but also reputation risk or trade secret risk, for instance. There are several risks, but there are also several incentives for the private sector to actually engage. And one, anyway, we have like 7 big incentives that we have worked on over the years. I'm not going to list them all, Paulo, but one, for instance, is clearly reciprocity, for instance, i.e. I share something and then I have access to something else. And that access to something else could be domain expertise, right? It might be that I actually have want to do something with the data, but they don't have the domain expertise in-house to really make sense of the data vis-a-vis that kind of topic. It could also be access to other data, which, like for instance, could provide for a data pool that provides for equal access to different types of data. The other, anyway, another incentive is clearly reputation, right? So the reason why so many private sector entities have stepped up during COVID-19 is A, for a public interest concern, but also, anyway, it was like, you don't want to be seen as not doing anything. and so there was clearly a reputation gain, which is a positive thing. I mean, I'm not against any kind of reputation gains, but you just need to understand what are the incentives. And then other incentives are, for instance, retainment of talent. I mean, it turns out that in many corporations, having access to data scientists is a key concern. And if the data scientist can work 20% of the time on a data for good initiative, it's quite often a retainment of talent strategy that they have developed as well. I mean, these are just 3 examples. There are other examples of incentives, but that doesn't mean that there remains a problem to engage the private sector over the longer period of time, because there is a clear sustainability concern. And so we need to really innovate with making the business case for actually providing access to data. It's very interesting to see that COVID-19, you had many corporations stepping up And then suddenly they realized COVID-19 is a marathon, not a sprint. and so we're still with COVID-19, and we're still going to be with COVID-19 for a pretty long period of time. And so we're going to see several of those initiatives are going to become less pronounced, because actually there's a huge cost involved in sustaining those over time for businesses to do so. I don't know, Paul, whether that answered your question, but these are just a few reactions.
Yeah, I think we could talk about this for like an hour.
Happy to, Paul.
So we have 3 minutes until the end. There's one more question from the audience that I think is a bit polemic, so I'm going to ask it. So from your experience, is there any type of government, like left, right, or any other division you prefer, that leans more towards good open data practices? And this is a question for both of you.
Okay. So
all yours, Natalia.
Yes, no, it's interesting to, like, we've been looking into the work, of course, of the open data collaboratives, and but we've been checking out just answering the later question, but checking out mostly the apps, the tracking apps, and understanding the institutional agreements around privacy. It's the governments that had really strong privacy institutions. Actually, some countries rolled back the tracking apps because of privacy concerns. So it's interesting to see how the institutional organizations of the governments and how the laws play in this conversation. And those countries that do not have a strong privacy law or institution, how they're dealing with COVID and these tracking systems. But going back to the question, from my experience, I cannot say for sure that there's a type of government that leans more towards good open data practices. I've seen and work, because it also depends on what you understand by a left and a right government. The definition here in Latin America, it's really different than the one from the US. For example, the Democratic Party in the United States is seen more of a left government, but left party. But if you bring it back to Latin America, it would be a right political party. So it also depends on what you understand on those categories. We've seen all types of governments and like political parties engage with this agenda. Fortunately, we've seen changes in administrations, like really hard ones, from like totally different political parties changing from administration to administration, where open data policies was still a state issue. So they kept the open data policies moving forward. It also has to do with the growing of the open data community. And I guess, for example, if you're a country member of the Open Government Partnership, you have the multi-stakeholder forum set it up. And so civil society organizations and the other governmental institutions are not going to let you drop off the open data policy, even if you're a left government or a right government. So I, from my experience, I cannot say that there's like one kind of government that actually prefers open data.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think it depends. I think what Natalia referred to also in her slides is that open data is not just a practice; it's a mindset, and it's really a commitment to a transparent governance. It's a commitment to good governance, because if you realize that you actually need to know what works and what does not work, for instance, that automatically will commit yourself to actually providing data that is high quality, that can make that kind of judgments. And so from my point of view, the best governments are those that are committed to broader principles of good governance, transparent governance, accountable governance, and also committed to actually improve the lives of their citizens by enabling others to also have the tools to make better decisions. And I think that's key in order for open data to work. If it's not part of that broader commitment, it is anyway. It's not sustainable, and it's also too easy to indeed get rid of if there is some kind of regime change. If you don't have that kind of commitment to really anyway use all tools available to actually improve decisions.
Okay, thank you so much for all your answers.